Welcome to our study of the heart of compassion. And with this study, we should be a little bit clear about what we mean with compassion. Compassion it's the greatness of mind. It's big mind, great mind, magnanimity. And so this covers both the quality of caring for others in the sense of self, looking after others, but it actually goes much further than that, because we could very well be stuck in this role of being caregiver, which is of course very good, but nevertheless still stuck within a duality where there's a strong sense of, you could almost say, hierarchy. Someone who is able to care for others and hence greater. That's sometimes the objection that we come across with regards to the notion of compassion, that it's associated with pity. And that's not what we mean with compassion in the Buddhist context. We mean something that genuinely is great. Tsukje or Ninje just means great heart. And that's the Tibetan word for compassion. It literally means Lord, the sort of Lord-like heart, but again, it's again not hierarchical. It just means great magnanimity, I think is a good word. But we talk about compassion not just in this sense of self to other, which is of course a big part of it, and is what we call relative bodhicitta. It's very valuable, but it also goes beyond that. It goes beyond any notion of me caring for others. It's just a place where there's not that self-consciousness in terms of serving others, but just a spontaneous presence for others without any reference back to a self that is giving. For example, if we were with somebody who's really great, really kind and compassionate, if we could read their mind and we could see in their mind they were thinking, oh, I'm really compassionate. You know, if we could read the mind of the Dalai Lama and we and we would see he's thinking, oh gosh, I'm so compassionate, right? Right away it would detract from what we would see as really greatness. See, real greatness wouldn't have that. It would just be complete selfless presence for others without that duality. And that's where we would say wisdom and compassion come together. The highest compassion is the wisdom that's not caught up in duality. And by nature, such wisdom without duality is naturally compassionate. So that's what we need to understand when we're approaching this. The heart of compassion is talking about the highest potential in terms of whatever could be. This is what is the Buddha. This is what is enlightenment. So we have here, in this context of teaching the heart of compassion, we have the complete path, nothing lacking. We've talked about three kinds of individuals. There's the kind of individual that would like to have peace, be happy, free, basically go to heaven. And then we have the individual who would like to be free from conditioning altogether, free from confusion, free from samsara. These two are still what we would call the sort of slightly lesser and slightly more average, but real superior aspiration. That is what we'd want to aspire to, is when we are not just content with our own happiness, but really wishing happiness for all sentient beings. The bringing all sentient beings to enlightenment. That's why Shantideva, he says, bodhicitta is the wish to establish all sentient beings on the level of perfect enlightenment. So within that section, we talk about the bodhicitta of aspiration, wishing, and cultivating that wish that others might be happy, and then the actual application. And with it, in this context, we're describing these two, the bodhicitta application, in terms of what we call relative bodhicitta, which is dealing with the world, and absolute bodhicitta, which is dealing with the actual nature of reality that permeates the world. And we've looked at that, and in that way we've covered these aspects, which are really, let me just see here, because there's some sections here I want to get right. Yeah. The text is divided into, let me see here. Oh yeah, yeah. It is the superior being is divided into essentially the bodhicitta of intention, the bodhicitta of application, and within application we talked about relative and absolute. And then the last section of that is then the training. So still within training for the superior being, those who wish enlightenment for all beings, then we have the we have then a particular training. So we've studied bodhicitta of aspiration, bodhicitta of application, and then now we're looking at the trainings. And in the trainings, we last time completed the section on, so within the trainings then, we have five parts. And by the way, you might think, why go over all these sections here? Well, it's very much part of the methodology. In a way, we could remember a book by these sections, just remembering what we talked about. Well, we talked about three kinds of individuals, and within the superior, three aspects, and so on. And then within this third aspect, which is then the training, we've covered, there's five. So we've covered the first, which was the 6 paramitas. Today we're going to look at 4 instructions as taught in the sutra. And then also there's 3 more, which is training in how to be rid of negative emotions, training in accomplishing others with mindfulness and vigilance, and then finally dedicating the merit. So this basically takes up these 3 sections, covers most of the 37. We have sort of, in addition, we have the opening, what we then call the main part, of which this is a part of, and then we have conclusion. But basically, we are then within the 37, we're basically covering that with these 3 aspects, namely bodhicitta of aspiration, bodhicitta of application, and then the trainings. So just to get that straight, get that away, important point really. And by the way, I don't know, I have the 2007 Shambhala edition, and I would imagine the other edition, the earlier one, has that. But you have then a textual outline at the beginning of the work, which is really helpful when you're studying, like I said, to sort of to remember it. So here we are. We're in the second section, the 3 kinds of individuals. The first being the introduction, then part 2, 3 kinds of individuals. We're in the third one, those of superior capacity, and then we're in the precepts. This is the third part of that. And then we're within those, there are 5 sections, and now we're in the second, which is training in the 4 instructions taught in the sutra. So the first of these 4 instructions taught in the sutra is to examine oneself for one's own defects and give them up. So this is basically just being honest about our defects. And by the way, when we do that, it's not as if we then fixate thinking, I am inferior, I have all these faults, and hence I am by definition inferior, or there's something wrong with me. It's just to be clear on, you know, if we're going somewhere, if we need to make sure that the road is open. And if the road is blocked by some way, then we need to negotiate that in one way or another. So we need to do some, it's not like this prevents us from anything. It's not that we're defined in terms of our defects, but it's more that we need to be aware of them. And the more we can take them out in the open and expose them, the freer we are of them. We should look at that. It's always much more helpful when we can be honest about our shortcomings. And even if that, you could say in itself, the argument for that is already strong enough, then we even have the example in our teachers who so often actually in a very humble, understated way, sort of expose their own shortcomings. And like I often say, I don't really believe them. I think it's more for our benefit that they might be pretending to have these defects, but nevertheless, we have a role model in them. Now, Ngulchu Togmé. Ngulchu Togmé says, if I do not examine my own defects, though outwardly a Dharma practitioner, I may act contrary to the Dharma. Therefore, continually to examine my own faults and give them up is the practice of the Bodhisattva. So we find our own faults and emphasis on, and then we give them up. It's not like, oh yeah, I have these faults and woe is I, but it's more, there are these, I'm going to not abide by them. Khyentse Rinpoche there in the opening, he says, ordinarily, whatever you say, whatever you do, say, or think is an expression of your belief in the true existence of both yourself as an individual and of phenomena as a whole. Your actions, as long as they're based on that false premise, can only be diluted and permeated by negative emotions. As you follow a teacher, however, you can learn how to keep everything you do with body, speech, and mind in accordance with the Dharma. So Rinpoche, he's identifying what we talked about just before in the section on the paramita of wisdom, which is this delusional fixation on ourself as solid and the delusion of phenomena as solid. So on the basis of that, we essentially operate from the egoic perspective, self above everything else. And that's where we're going to be caught up in toxic attitudes and emotions. So this is where we then, as someone apprenticing on the path, that we assimilate the qualities, gauge the qualities of the teacher. So that's how we then begin to, we have a clear sense of what to do with our body, our speech, and our mind. So we have to be clear, we could fool everybody. We could look like outside, like we're a very good practitioner, but we should rely on what we also say in the Lojong teaching, on the first witness. There's of course the others that might be witnesses to us, but more important is really what we know is going on inside us. And that's where we need to rely on that witness, which is the first witness. And that's where we say only we know whether or not we're remedying our ignorance and afflicted states. It's not about us looking like good practitioners in one way or another. It's simply about knowing what's happening with ourselves. And that, due to the, like Rinpoche was just saying, due to these habits, then our mind, which is like a clear mirror, it continually attracts the dust. And so we should be clear that we don't fall into just allowing that dust to settle. Again, this is not about us seeing ourselves as imperfect. We are like a clear mirror, that's perfect. But we just need to see that our true nature is not contaminated. So this is not about us being good and then judging others as being less good. It's about me being quite simply aware of what's going on in our mind. We needn't judge ourselves, we needn't judge others. It's just about being present. And this we do with our attention to this introspection that knows what's happening within our mind. This is what is called mindfulness, just being present with what's happening in our mind. So as we are practitioners of the Dharma, we, like Khyentse and Ngulchu often highlights, almost the biggest danger when we're on the path is that we might have this arrogance, thinking, oh, even if we practice well, or we think we practice well, then that comes with this self-importance, conceit, arrogance. This is very easily our, well, one thing is that we want to be good practitioners, but even if we are, then we have this, could have this blind spot about our own self-importance. Now, here Khyentse Rinpoche then highlights 4 downfalls where afflicting afflictions, the kleshas, cause destructive actions. Now notice there's a relationship between karma and kleshas. Kleshas says once we have delusion, then we have this egoic perspective the kleshas, essentially the afflictions or the destructive emotions. These exist as impulses. They exist as psychological conditions that arise, but they drive us. They are impulses that then lead to actions. And when we begin to engage these toxic attitudes, what initially just are subtle aspects of our mind, when we engage them, they become part of us. And that's where we lay down habitual patterns. And that's the nature of karma, where we lay down strong patterns that become part of us and resurface in various ways. So we could, as practitioners then, out of desire, we could praise ourselves and disparage others. We could become very skillful at that. We could become very, Tibetans are quite, how do you get into that kind of self-deprecation where they actually would say, we are so good at this kind of hypocritical comportment. And this is something that we could become very good at. Some just have some subtle way of lifting ourselves up and making others look not so good. So we have to be attentive to that. Out of miserliness, not to give to those in need, and not to give the Dharma to those worthy. Again, these are patterns that are not good, being stuck in this kind of narrowness. Then we could, out of animosity and hatred, abusing others, and actually harbor this kind of deep felt resentment or anger to people who, even though they have gone against us and then apologize, then we uphold this kind of resentment. So one is to be abusive, physically, verbally, and the other is also to not forgive. The last one is to criticize the Mahayana teachings, where we might look at some of the teachings of the Mahayana, where we really, more than anything, highlight the centrality of attitude. In the Mahayana, we would say sometimes it's even necessary to act in what appears to be a negative way. We have examples of the Buddha in the previous life who actually engaged in negative actions simply just out of care for others. So that's where sometimes people might criticize Mahayana teachers. For example, there might be Mahayana teachers that are not monks. There might be Mahayana teachers who behave in strange ways, like we have the story of Tilopa, who would be eating fish and so on. We have great teachers who might appear to be like the great Dilgo Khyentse, who is an incarnation of Jigme, who appeared to be a hunter, and so on. So we might sort of hold ourselves as being better than that. So that's what we need to avoid. So we should be very careful about anything that we do, and with actions, we're not just referring to physical actions, but body, speech, and mind. And that requires, of course, that we have this continual awareness. We would say mindfulness is being present. Awareness is that knowing of what's going on in our mind. So that was the first one, which is exposed, basically being aware of our own shortcomings. Let's see here, to examine oneself for one's own defects and give them up. Now the second one of these four is to give up speaking of a bodhisattva's faults. So it says, if impelled by negative emotions, I relate the faults of other bodhisattvas, I will myself degenerate. Therefore, to not talk about the faults of anyone who has entered the Mahayana is the practice of the bodhisattva. So when we take into consideration the relationship that we have had to sentient beings everywhere, as they have cared for us at one point or another, we never know who is actually really our friend, who's our enemy. Even though people appear to be our friend right now, they might have been our enemy before, they might be our enemy in the future, and our enemies might in fact be people who become our friends. So that's where we should include all sentient beings really as objects of our respect. And particularly those who have entered the Sangha, like Rinpoche says, even they all come from a place of possibly acknowledging that, yes, there is suffering, that we need to do something about the suffering, that phenomena that are compounded are impermanent, and so on. So we should respect the Sangha, and particularly the bodhisattvas who have, even if they might not be that good at it, they have essentially vowed to serve all sentient beings. And all the various Dharma traditions that we come across, they all possess sages, they all possess pith-instructions, they all represent the path to enlightenment. When we do see defects in a bodhisattva's conduct, we should think it's our own personal impure projection. You know, we can always choose between what we choose to see, right? We can choose half empty, half full. And we could look at so many different things in our circumstances, in the behavior of others. And we should, if we are drawn to perceive the negative aspects of somebody who is a bodhisattva, we should really see this as just being us who seem to be fascinated with what is negative. And this is really just being us getting entangled in our impure projection. And at the end of the day, we don't know really who is a real bodhisattva, who isn't. So it's a better idea to not fall for this kind of for our own flawed logic that believes in the truth of our projections. So we should view bodhisattvas, in fact, all beings, like close relatives. And we should recognize that in that all beings are innately pure. They possess Buddha nature. Right now, there are sentient beings that are wandering in samsara, and yet having that seed, they could very well, they will at one point eliminate confusion, and that seed will manifest. The bodhisattvas who have actually vowed and to serve sentient beings and who are on the path, wherever they are on the path, they possess qualities that rise far above ordinary confusion. We should see them really as spotless individuals, particularly when we talk about great bodhisattvas like Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Samantabhadra, and so on. And we should have this pure outlook and faith in the teaching and in the teacher, seeing the teacher purely in terms of their qualities. And that's particularly true when it comes to Vajrayana, where our entire path is the teacher. The entire path is caught up with or based on the teacher and devotion to the teacher. So that's where we're shooting ourselves in the leg at the moment that we begin to be critical of the teacher. Our entire Vajrayana path is dependent really on our pure perception of the teacher. That doesn't mean that we should be naive, and before we enter into a relationship with the Vajrayana teacher, we need to assess whether they are the real deal. And of course, this is complex, particularly in the modern world where we have practically no exposure to the culture of enlightenment. That's where in Asia and Buddhist cultures, there's a lot more, you could say, consumer discernment in terms of gurus. There's an existing culture of weeding out those who don't qualify as teachers. But nevertheless, within the teachings, there are guidelines, and also we wouldn't want to engage in the Vajrayana right away. But this is, of course, complex, but we certainly, as practitioners, then this awareness of how we project our own shortcomings onto others is something we should be really attentive to. Khyentse Rinpoche says, once you start finding defects somewhere, you will see them everywhere and in everyone. By proclaiming someone's faults to all and sundry, you're burning yourself and hurting the other person, which can only be wrong. It is the Sangha that upholds the teachings. Its members must be in harmony and their discipline perfect. Develop confidence and pure vision. And that's, of course, where we need to apply this to ourselves. We can't expect others. We can't say, hey, did you see that? Khyentse Rinpoche says that you're supposed to be in harmony, you're supposed to have perfect discipline. We can't really do that. These teachings need to be applied to, the one that's touching our nose. So the third one, the third of four, is to give up attachment to a sponsor's property. Again, this is something that is very intrinsic to monastic culture, where very often you have renunciates who are dependent on their sponsors, and there you could have this issue of hoping for, material gain just on the basis of your supposed spiritual purity, right? So Ngulchu Togmé says, offerings and respect may bring discord and cause listening, reflection, and desire and meditation to decline. Therefore, to avoid attachment to the homes of friends and benefactors is the practice of a bodhisattva. So this is where it's necessary to, regardless of who we are, to understand that the ordinary worldly ambition to become wealthy and to have all these conditions in place that gives an immediate comfort, they are ultimately futile. These things that we amass naively thinking that they're going to be providing happiness, they are completely futile. At the end of our life, we can't take them with us, and they're not anything that really helps us in terms of what really matters. We need, in terms of property, in terms of having enough, we need the ultimate wealth, which is contentment. The ordinary in the world in general, all the things that we think of as being essential to our life and to sustaining ourselves, they actually generally they just bring suffering. All the things that we're supposed to achieve in an ordinary context, they operate within a very unimaginative, narrow perspective that doesn't really see beyond just satisfying the senses and achieving some very limited goals. These ordinary activities, they ultimately just bring suffering. The only thing that really will bring happiness is Dharma, simply because Dharma is aligned with the way things are, with reality. The others, not actually aligned with reality. They appear to be aligned with reality, but that's only from a deceived, confused perspective. So for us then to know what is really helpful and not, this is then the practice of the bodhisattva. Khyentse Rinpoche says, when you practice Dharma, to begin with, you may experience hardships, but later those sufferings give way to great happiness and serenity. With worldly activities, however, it is just the opposite. To begin with, they seem to bring happiness, but later they deteriorate into suffering, for such is their nature. To keep making the right choice in this matter is the practice of the bodhisattva. Then there's giving up harsh speech. Harsh words disturb the minds of others and spoil our own bodhisattva practice. Therefore, to give up rough speech, which others find unpleasant, is the practice of a bodhisattva. So we might have engaged in the Mahayana path. We might have taken the bodhisattva vow. If we have done that, we should only speak gentle words and words that encourage. There's a place where Longchenpa, in what's called the 30 advice, he says, we might, with the best of intention, tell others about their shortcomings, but to do so will only ulcerate their hearts. To only speak gentle words is my advice from the heart. So that's where we should really, as also sort of folksy wisdom that would say, what is it again? If you don't have anything good to say, then just don't say anything. Something along those lines, right? So that's where once we criticize others and we hurt others, it just creates this mountain of negativity. It doesn't lead anything good with us with it. So that's where bodhisattvas, they really exert themselves in making sure that what they say is something that makes others happy. It's something that leads others to appreciating the Dharma. Khyentse Rinpoche says, if you allow unkind words to spew out of your mouth, you will upset not only other people's mind, but your own mind too. At such moments, the bodhisattva's way is lost. Those who divulge other people's failings, loudly proclaiming them everywhere, or disparage teachers and other spiritual lineages, are only building themselves a mountain of negativity. So we have now come to we've covered the 6 paramitas, we've covered the 4, what are they again, the 4 things to be renounced according to the sutra. So we presently now look at training in how to be rid of the negative emotions. Ngulchu Togmé says, when emotions become habitual, they're hard to get rid of with antidotes. Therefore, with mindfulness and vigilance, to seize the weapon of the antidote and crush attachment and other emotions the moment they arise is the practice of a bodhisattva. So whatever we practice, we have 2 objectives. One has to do with our relative reality, and the other has to do with actual reality. The first has to do with the negative emotions. The second is belief in substantial existence. So the first is more on the level of skillful means, and the second is more in terms of wisdom. For us to, whatever practice we're doing, we would see that the value of the practice is that our ordinary rough disposition, our kleshas, toxic attitudes and emotions, they become less. That's the sign of someone practicing. And this doesn't mean that we just become goody two-shoes and terribly nice and all of that. It actually links up with the absence of the delusion in self-centering. So while that's taking place, we're also dissolving through that. We're skillfully dissolving the deluded belief in our substantial self, and also implicitly in doing so, we'll notice that we're also more flexible with regards to the circumstances externally. We are less prone to solidify the phenomenal world. And so we could say almost organically these 2 are linked together. With less emotions, we have less of this belief in substantial existence. And on the other hand also, if we are less caught up in the belief in the substantial existence, also our struggle with the phenomena in terms of rigid self-centering and a sort of a hard relationship with the world around us, that also becomes less. And so that's why also we have less negative emotions. So these 2, they work together. Now, this all takes place on the basis of us essentially getting caught up in our thoughts and our attitudes. And this is where it's so important that we have mindfulness and vigilance, that we actually are not distracted as practitioners of meditation, it's essential that we sustain this mindfulness and vigilance, mindfulness and awareness. Of course, we train in it while we're sitting, but it's also what is going to save us from disaster when we're engaging with ordinary life, everyday life. So it's only when we can notice, actually, Khyentse Rinpoche was saying, when you begin to practice vipassana, you hopefully will be blessed with things just not working out when you're distracted. So when we begin to meditate, then things begin to become very difficult when we're actually not engaging in the practice of meditation. It's almost as if our Buddha nature says, oh, you've begun to sort of approach what is real. Please don't let go of it. And so then it's almost like magical that then the circumstances, they turn against us. We become not very good at handling things when we're not actually sustaining mindfulness and vigilance. And these are really what is going to enable us to get to the bottom of these two objectives: eliminating negative emotions and our belief in substantial existence. So this on the basis of recognizing how destructive it is when we let the thoughts proliferate, we need to engage this mindfulness, this awareness that is about continual vigilance. So we recognize that what needs to be done is extracting ourselves from the grip of destructive emotions, and we need to understand that it's not just that it would be nice that we were less caught up in these toxic attitudes and thoughts. We need to actually see that they don't exist. And once we know that, we know how flawed it is to actually subscribe to the dictate of what in fact are just empty thoughts. We need to humbly acknowledge that even though we know that, then we still fall for this dictatorship of these destructive patterns. And that's where we need to be determined. We need to, sometimes we in the Buddhist teaching, we use words like wage war, or we're going to crush the emotions and so on. And some people might not like that and think, oh, that's way too sort of militant language. But it's really, however you choose to see it. If you don't like that language, then you see, well, we should see through them or transcend it or whatever. But at the end of the day, they need to go, because they're really the enemies that keep us circulating in suffering. And the good thing is, like Khyentse Rinpoche says, they're not as if they're like outside enemies that we can't get rid of. And if we repel the enemy, they can go and hide somewhere and come back. Actually, the good thing about the thoughts is that they can't actually go anywhere, because we are there. We can see them, and that's where we can actually eliminate them through simply recognition. Not that difficult, but it is something that runs contrary to our habitual patterns. And that's where we need to have this vigilance, this practice of meditation, and also mindfulness at any given moment. So if we want to do that, it's indispensable that we practice meditation. And with meditation, we have the aspects of skillful means, which are very good, and very often we have meditations that involve all sorts of things, especially like Vajrayana meditation. But if that meditation is not linked up with shamatha and vipassana, then it will just be empty ritual. And that's where the Vajrayana methods, and any method that we engage in all the various Buddhist practices of the path, they have to have as their foundation this vision of our thoughts what bring us down, and how we should become skilled in not being entangled in the thoughts. And being skilled and not tangled in the thoughts very difficult if we're busy, even if we're busy with all sorts of Dharma activity. If we don't really get down to the bios of the sort of the ground of our being and see through the tyranny of the thoughts, and that is what shamatha vipassana provides, then all these various things we do, they might provide some good habits, but they won't really get to the bottom of the issue. So Rinpoche, he says, always stay alert, therefore, and watch what your mind is doing. Think about it. Over countless lifetimes, have you not been deluded, fallen under the power of your negative emotions, and as a result had to undergo time and time again the sufferings of birth, sickness, old age, and death? Yet still you cling to samsara as if it were a happy place. The reason we do this, the reason we get caught in this is, again, we need to be clear on that, is the belief in an I. And once we have the I, this is where within the pure primordial ground, the arising of cognizance is mistaken to be a self, simply just becoming self-conscious in what is this original pure luminous expanse. We reduce this quality into this unfortunate condition of thinking I, and once we have the I, then there's the notion of this that in which the I stands in relationship to, which is other. And once we have that, then the 5 skandhas evolve, and with that we have the notion of ourselves with a place, a particular body, and our particular experiences, our perceptions. That essentially is what we carry with us from lifetime to lifetime. We project an external realm, we project a body, and we project our perceptions, and we solidify them. This is very different from the way that we are taught in modern physics. It's very different from the way that in the modern world that we assume that there is some external physical material that is actually what constructs our consciousness. The thing about that is that if we analyze it, if we really dare to go in and be critical of this kind of science, we can see that there is actually not really a foundation present. There's a big explanatory gap in terms of how the phenomenal world and our consciousness actually interact. That with the fact that we actually end up with having a belief system that is founding on this, what we can call materialist perspective, is actually is not grounded in some unanimous view from, you could say, the authorities on science, but it's just something that filters down as a cultural concept, cultural construct that really has to do with the way that modern worldview has evolved. But if, as Buddhists, we actually go in and analyze critically what are the assumptions there that are present, and is there really a basis for that? Then we can actually see that there's not really solid ground for these assumptions. In the Buddhist teaching, what we're encouraging here is not some subscription to a belief system, but rather us looking at how we mistakenly, how we in our delusion construct some realities that actually has no basis. And then it's quite clear how the experience of the phenomenal world out there, so-called experience of a location or a realm or a world, is not something that can be found in terms of the actual particles or the actual building blocks of phenomena, but exists on the basis of the mind that projects onto this phenomena. And same also with regards to our body and also all the various perceptions we have. This, of course, is a big discussion, but it really is essential, particularly in the modern world where there's a very different view on our whole existence and the nature of our whole world. And that's where actually modern Buddhists, they actually have to resolve this divide. And we could say, oh yeah, it's just Cinderella teachings, whether we say that it's saying that there's a phenomena out there, our relative world, and it's really whether rebirth and so on is just production. There's not really any. Ultimately, there is no. That's true from the absolute point of view. That is so true, but within our relative experience of living the way we do and experiencing ourselves the way we do, then this is something that we need to relate to. And so we need to differentiate between relative and absolute truth in that sense. And certainly presently, we are very much caught within this duality, self and other, and what comes from it, the experience of a world, a location, experience of body, and our perceptions. So Khyentse Rinpoche, he makes the point that we can free this delusion of I with the application of meditation and antidotes like Lojong practice. That's where the practice of no longer perpetuating this rigid sense of self, and also on the basis of that, no longer perpetuating the experience of other, then also the experiences and the rigidity around these three that we mentioned here, they begin to dissolve. And in terms of our post-meditation practice, when we're engaged with the world, we engage with this practice of Lojong, which essentially is that which trains the mind in having this magnanimity and courage in terms of relating with our life, our experiences. And that's where these two, the practice of meditation and Lojong practice, very much works with what we call the absolute truth and relative truth, absolute bodhicitta and relative bodhicitta. So when we apply the path in this way, this is something that enables us to extract ourselves from our ordinary painful condition, and it enables us to, as an extension of that, spontaneously to care for others. Rinpoche says, only an omniscient Buddha could know how long ago it was that you fell into the delusion of samsara, in which you have spent an incalculable number of lives. All beings must have been your parents in one life or another. Realizing this, feel a deep, impartial love for them all. So this is heart of the Mahayana, is understanding the nature of reality and understanding how sentient beings suffer through not understanding reality. But that's why we need to have a little bit of courage in terms of our analysis of what reality is. That's where it's very worthwhile to look at what the Buddha has to say about this. So then number 4, training in accomplishing others' good with mindfulness and vigilance. Again, this the presence of mind is sustained through these two aspects: mindfulness, the presence, and the vigilance that that knows what's happening with our mind. In short, Ngulchu Togmé says, wherever I am, whatever I do, to be continually mindful and alert, asking, what is the state of my mind? And accomplishing the good of others is the practice of a bodhisattva. So this is essentially us just being aware of the headquarters. What is actually the place in which everything actually begins. This, all our attitudes and actions originate from this key space of our consciousness, our mind. So Rinpoche says we keep, oh no, Rinpoche doesn't say this, but summing up what Rinpoche says is that we need to stay aware that what we're doing with body, speech, and mind is in alignment with the Dharma. And at the end of every day, we should actually see, how did I do? That's where sometimes we will, our teachers would recommend to, at the end of the day, just practice some recitation of Vajrasattva with an awareness of where it is that there's room for improvement. And that's where, as far as the choices we make in our lives, in terms of our conduct, in terms of aligning ourselves with the Dharma, in terms of our body, speech, and mind, we're continually, almost every moment, we're up against making choices. And that's where we should be very clear that we could fall into habitual patterns, just follow what seems to be nice, fun, pleasant, comfortable, etc. But if it doesn't really align with the much greater bliss of the Dharma, and it really just is going for some cheap thrills or just sustaining our comfort or being caught up within our own rather unimaginative comfort zone, we are then mistaking ordinary stones, the ordinary just habits that we might think gives us a little bit of happiness, for priceless jewels, which is what we presently have in our hands with the awareness of the Dharma and its benefit. So Dharma, Chö, means to repair and cultivate. Well, Dharma, we would say, has 10 different meanings. And one of them is Chö, which actually means to repair what is our faults and cultivate positive qualities. It means to be proactive in terms of doing something about something. Sure. So that's why we're being proactive about doing something with things. That's one of the meanings of Dharma, one of the 10 meanings of Dharma. And so that's where we dedicate our entire being, meaning our body, speech, and mind, to others' well-being. That's really what is, like Rinpoche says, that's the heart of the Mahayana. And he quotes Langri Tangpa, in the Mahayana, there is nothing else to do but benefit beings. So don't let your armor of helping others be too small. Rinpoche says something very beautiful, very profound and concise. He says, if your intentions are purely altruistic, without any self-clinging, perfection will naturally arise. If your intentions are purely altruistic, without any self-clinging, perfection will naturally arise. I don't know if any of you ever saw Brilliant Moon, which is the story of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. It's written and directed by one of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's students, a great Lama called Choling Rinpoche. And the Choling Rinpoche is a close, also a co-student, like Tongse Khyentse Rinpoche, they're both students of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And Tongse Khyentse Rinpoche had Choling Rinpoche make this movie. And it's very beautiful. And in there, there's an interview with Matthew Ricard. And Matthew Ricard talks briefly about the power of a teacher. And he says, ordinary people, they could give you advice. But when it comes from somebody who really has greatness, then it takes on such great authority. So like he was saying, the teacher could talk about impermanence, but when you hear, anybody could talk about impermanence, but when you hear it from somebody like Dilgo Khyentse, it really comes with such strength and weight and authority. And so something like this, we could have it as a fridge magnet also, and everybody could say this, but when it comes from Khyentse Rinpoche, there's something very, very powerful. And I remember reading this and just thinking, gosh, there's just one line here, and it comes from a sage. We could almost just take that one line and abide by it. carries so much power of truth. So the essence of this instruction is to let go of this deluded fixation on me. It is about our inner attitude, not about external behavior. Again, this is about the attitude that we bring with us all the time. We might say, well, I don't know if what I'm doing is really good, but in a way we do. We know what our motivation is. So this is not about behavior externally, but it's about what's happening inside in terms of our motivation. So we could see that there are many great yogis, many sages of the past, who in no way touted themselves or presented themselves or promoted themselves as anything special. And this is also where it's a great gift actually to sometimes be in Buddhist cultures where you meet such unassuming yogis. In my life, some of the most powerful teachings have been meeting ordinary people who I could just see were genuine practitioners, and yet there was no show of it. I remember being in attending teachings with the Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and in the assembly there was this man, and a friend of mine said, "He's always sleeping, this man." And I was sitting near him, I kind of looked at him, and I actually realized he looked like he was sleeping, but he was actually very, very present. But he was somebody who I would say was in continual meditation, and yet he didn't sit up and look like he was some sort of special person. He was just sitting very quietly, but there was such authenticity about him, I thought. And then we talked together. I remember when we talked, he took my hand, and his hand felt just like Dilgo Khyentse's hand. It was really warm. It was just not too dry, not too humid or anything. Just perfect and warm, and his voice and his presence, demeanor, and so on was one of a genuine practitioner. And yet nobody would. Later, some people recognize him as having some being a yogi, but in those days nobody actually, he didn't have any reputation of any kind, and not just him, but other practitioners, men and women. This is so inspiring. So what really is of course the value of our practice is whether or not we have compassion. That's what would be the hallmark, really. Khyentse Rinpoche says, it does not matter how your actions might seem to anyone else. No particular compassionate appearance is necessary. What you need is a pure mind. So now we're reaching to the last section, dedicating the merit to perfect enlightenment. So Ngulchu Togmé writes, dedicating to enlightenment through wisdom purified of the three concepts, all merit achieved by such endeavor, to remove the suffering of numberless beings is the practice of a bodhisattva. I'm going to read that again. Dedicating to enlightenment through wisdom purified of the three concepts, all merit achieved by such endeavor, to remove the suffering of numberless beings is the practice of bodhisattva. Why? Where compassion and wisdom really attains its power is when we're not caught up in subject, object, and action. You see, if we have that, again, like I was saying before, if the Dalai Lama sits and teaches and he thinks, "Gosh, I'm compassionate," or if the Dalai Lama thinks, "I am so generous and they are so lucky, and I'm giving this precious teaching to them," then there's this subject, object, and action. And why we venerate the Dalai Lama is because we presume that he doesn't have that. Of course, it will take somebody, a great bodhisattva, to know whether or not the Dalai Lama has it. But at the same time, I've I've had the privilege to meet the Dalai Lama 46 years ago, and throughout my life, I've always, and actually, you know, regularly listened to his teachings, seen him. I'm convinced that the Dalai Lama doesn't have that, and I'm convinced that my teachers are free from this. I'm convinced that my teachers are not thinking, gosh, I'm a wonderful teacher giving these teachings to those people. There's not that hierarchy, and there's also not that duality, basic subject, object, and action. So whatever we do, we would want to, even if we don't have that, then we dedicate. We would say, even if we can't have that non-duality, at least what we can do is think, whatever good there is, I give it away to others. So we dedicate our virtues with body, speech, and mind to the enlightenment of all sentient beings. So we do something good and we are aware of it. We might think, gosh, I really did something wonderful. But then in the absence of this non-duality, at least we just think, okay, this was good, admittedly, but may I not be attached to this and may I dedicate this to others. So we would say if we sort of hold on to this and sort of impressed with ourselves, then it's just like, yes, there is some benefit, but it quickly exhausts, like Rinpoche was saying, like a drop of water on a hot stone surface, and it quickly evaporates. Whereas if we dedicate it, it's like putting a drop of water into the ocean. It is not lost. So the ultimate kind of dedication, that is when we're then free from subject, object, and action. But then again, until we have this kind of realization, we would dedicate. And that's where we have some dedications. Of course, we could make up our own, and like Khyentse Rinpoche, he's often saying, please make up your own. But we do have some that have a lot of power because they have been chanted by great individuals down through the ages, and they very often are very clear in their intention. So that's where we have the famous dedication prayer that runs just as fearless Manjushri did to attain omniscience, and in the same way that Samantabhadra likewise did too, just so, to follow all of them and train myself, I perfectly dedicate these meritorious actions. So you might think, well, how do I actually really dedicate? I don't really know. Well, then we could just say, I'm just going to dedicate the way that Manjushri did it, the way that Samantabhadra did it. And then we have another aspiration prayer that we very often see, and that's, when we complete something good, we make a dedication, and then also what we can do is make an aspiration. It's a very powerful moment if we've done something good, to dedicate to others and also to make aspirations. And that's where one of them is, throughout all our lives, may we never separate from the perfect teacher. May we avail ourselves of all the beneficial glory of the Dharma, fully perfecting the qualities of the paths and bhumis. May we swiftly reach the very level of Vajradhara. Sometimes we say, may we swiftly reach the very level of the guru, or the teacher, the Lama. So these were the 37 verses, and now we come to part 3 in the book. We have mainly the opening sections of the book. Then we have the main section, which was the 37, and then some concluding verses. So how and for whom this text was composed? Following the teachings of the holy beings, I have arranged the points taught in the sutras, tantras, and shastras as a 37-fold practice of a bodhisattva. Let me just fix that one. Quite funny. I think it must say for due benefit. Does it say for due benefit? I think it must. Not be for thy benefit. Let's see here. I know some of you are sitting out there saying, yeah, it says due. Oh, For the benefit, of course. Yeah, for the benefit. Okay. Okay. So Ngulchu Togmé, he wrote this, but this was based on his Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, he makes a point of not anybody can really write a Dharma text. This was composed by somebody who had the capacity, the aspirations. It's like also we have the similarly Shantideva at the end of his where the Bodhisattva makes similar statement where he really just says this is just in order for me to essentially correct myself, which is a very humble way of putting it. But Rinpoche points out to compose a shastra, which this belongs to. This is like a pith instruction. It's a bit more than a shastra, but we classify it as shastra. Then it really requires either perfect realization, that's what Rinpoche he mentions Asanga and Nagarjuna, or vision of the deity, as in the case of Shantideva, or complete knowledge of all the sciences. And Rinpoche was referring to all the what we call all the great panditas of India. And these are the requirements. So Rinpoche makes the point that Ngulchu Togmé, Khyentse Togmé, he had all these qualities. We have here an instruction that gathers succinctly all teachings on bodhicitta. And we can see, since this was composed in, I think, the 14th century, then this has been a teaching that has been passed on really as one of the quintessential instructions, just like the way of the bodhisattva. And in Buddhist cultures, in Tibetan culture, in Bhutanese culture, and so on, this is something that school children actually learn by heart. It's something that is so succinct and so essential and so powerful and clear. And what really makes this extraordinary is that this was composed based on love and compassion. This is not something that somebody wrote in order to enhance their career or that they could make money on it or whatever. This is something that really came from a very pure place. Rinpoche says, Khyentse Ngulchu Togmé wrote it not because he hoped for fame or recognition, but out of sheer love and compassion. That is why these teachings have been able to help countless beings down through the centuries. They are the very words of Avalokiteshvara in human form. If you practice according to these precepts, all concern for yourself will be dispelled, and you will find it easy to turn all your efforts toward benefiting others. The unerring nature of these practices. Since my understanding is poor, this is Ngulchu Togmé speaking, and I have little education, this is no composition to delight the learned, but as it is based on the sutras and teachings of holy beings, I think it is genuinely the practice of the bodhisattvas. So we should recognize that this advice that we have here is something that is immensely helpful for us. We might think there are higher teachings. For various reasons, we might think that the subtle teachings, the highest teachings, is really the only ones that would be useful. But it's not really about what is the highest. It's about what actually helps us. So Rinpoche says, bodhicitta opens the door to whatever practice you do. It is the skillful means by which you can make progress on the path of liberation. And it is the indispensable catalyst that enables you to harvest the fruit. Bodhicitta should be the very core and life force of your practice. And I think most of us are aware that this is something that teachers at all times, everywhere, they emphasize. We're fooling ourselves if we think we can dispense with something like this. In here, we have the highest teachings and also teachings that really meet us where we are. And then a humble prayer for forgiveness, which Togmé writes, however, it is hard for someone unintelligent like me to fathom the great ways of the bodhisattva's activities. So I beg the forgiveness of the holy ones for my contradictions, irrelevances, and other mistakes. So this is very helpful for us on the path to be have as a role model then someone like Ngulchu Togmé. The exposure of their own shortcomings, this is very much the hallmark of a great being, a bodhisattva. Okay, this is again, the guy who did this was clearly not very mindful. So, okay, so Rinpoche, he says, and I like this, just as the branches of a tree laden with fruit bend low, so too the sage filled with good qualities and knowledge keeps to the very humblest position. So, yeah. Dedicating the merit of having composed this text through the merit arising from this, and through the power of the sublime bodhicitta, relative and absolute, may all beings become like the Lord Avalokiteshvara, who is beyond the extremes of samsara and nirvana. So we would say, and this also we discussed in the initial homage to Avalokiteshvara, out of wisdom, Avalokiteshvara is free from confusion, is free from samsara, and yet out of compassion, Avalokiteshvara is free from nirvana. Nirvana is not something we would want to strive for in the sense of a personal peace. So when we say the extremes of samsara and nirvana, that's the two extremes of getting entangled within ourselves so that we are wandering and suffering, and also being entangled in ourselves of just wanting to stay in a place that's peaceful. And so just staying in a place that's peaceful could never be enlightenment, because there's still the attachment to the one who stays in the peace. And so Avalokiteshvara, who is referred to as the father of all the Buddhas, is someone who, embodying awakening, is neither confused through wisdom, not caught up in absorption through compassion. So Khyentse Togmé, the Bodhisattva Togmé, dedicates to the liberation of self and others, and so that others in turn may cultivate the two bodhicittas, with the wisdom to be free and the compassion to serve. So Ngulchu Togmé dedicates this, of course, so that sentient beings no longer will suffer, that they temporarily may have happiness and ultimate liberation. But for that to take place, really, is then wishing that they cultivate these two bodhicittas, the relative bodhicitta that is directed towards the suffering of sentient beings, and the wisdom that is being free from any confusion, that all beings may have this. So with this, he aspires that and prays that all may follow the example of the father of all the Buddhas, Avalokiteshvara. So the colophon, then you say the circumstance in which this was written, and okay, this is minor, but just being a perfectionist now. For his own benefit and that of others, Togmé, a teacher of scripture and logic, composed this at Rinpoche in Ngulchu. So this Ngulchu Togmé wasn't, I think he was in his early 30s when he wrote this, and he was just had a humble position as a teacher. And at this occasion, he then wrote this. Rinpoche says the text was written by the great saint Gyaltsuk Ngulchu Togmé in his hermitage Rinpoche, the Jewel Cave, which is in Ngulchu, central Tibet. The name Togmé means unobstructed, and indeed his learning and insight regarding the most profound aspects of theory and practice knew no boundary or hindrance whatsoever. So Rinpoche gives some advice here at the very end. He says this teaching needs to be integrated in every aspect of our lives. And he gives the example of people who, like Milarepa, who completely made there, we would say, the complete unification of Dharma and our own mind. That's really the objective, the hallmark of being of fully having integrated the Dharma. So you should look into the face of Rinpoche and his gaze and see someone who deeply cares and has deep sympathy and wishes all the very best for our practice. What is so important is that we don't waste this opportunity, having been born a human, having met the Dharma, having met a teacher, having the opportunity to practice. And we should keep in mind that, well, Trungpa Rinpoche, in a very modern vernacular, he says, we shouldn't think the Buddha came out of a lotus. He came out of a factory. And we should remember that Buddhas began as ordinary beings. And it's through their practice of the path, accumulating wisdom, accumulating merit, putting all the causes and conditions into place, that they became enlightened. So now we have no doubt about how to do this. We have the know-how, how to follow the Buddhas. And so the Buddhas, beginning like we did as ordinary beings, and we now have all the means to follow their example. We should realize the value of our present situation and not waste this opportunity. We possess the same fortune as the Buddhas. So next time, please read the rest of the book. Yeah, there's some appendixes in the back. That's what we'll be going through. Yeah. So please read this for next time. There's also a very beautiful mind training prayer at the very end. So no questions? You're very welcome to ask questions. Then again, I guess there's nothing lacking in Rinpoche's explanation, so we're well off. So there's a question here. As the text mentioned, whenever you think or do something harmful or false, it's important to recognize them. As soon as negative emotions arise, swoop down on them with mindfulness. I indeed find many ridiculous thoughts jumping out of my mind, but once I recognize them, I would feel regret and embarrassment. Could you please share more about how to be mindful at this point? Is it good to chant the Vajrasattva mantra? Yes, you're doing very well. I mean, don't get too, it's predictable that we have all the causes and conditions for all sorts of ridiculous thoughts. That's a given. We're onto it, and that's really what the point is. So actually, it's okay to feel regret and embarrassment to the extent that we recognize that, sort of like, oh, that's silly, but we shouldn't get too bogged down by it. The fact that our innate nature is pure means that all the confused thoughts and actions that occur, they're really external to what we actually are. And that's where we could very well be completely honest about our ridiculous thoughts and really just be clear that this is not what we want to be. And yes, we could feel some regret and embarrassment about it, but then we move on. We basically leave them. We park them by the curb. We leave them, and we don't necessarily need to perpetuate them. But that is where it is very helpful to use the bodhisattva mantra together with what we call the four powers, which is then the presence of the teacher in the form of bodhisattva, the regret that you clearly have, the embarrassment, the determination to not perpetuate this, and then to engage in, you could say, application of this, actually living this then further on. So in that way, but it's important also to not be worried about thoughts. So the thoughts, they can arise, but it's only the degree to which we begin to allow them to have traction, that we begin to follow after these impulses, that they really are a problem. So with that introspection, like Rinpoche says, to swoop down on them with mindfulness, if we do that, then we won't be harmed. They won't, they won't lead us astray. So yes, with that mindfulness and then chanting Vajrasattva mantra with the four powers, that's a very good place to be. Mm-hmm. You see that picture with Rinpoche sitting there holding the elephant? Rinpoche had a thing for elephants. When he would sit and doodle, which, bodhisattvas don't really doodle, but sometimes when Rinpoche had been around, we would find pieces of paper that he had been writing on. And then sometimes there would be this. There was one piece of I was in Rinpoche's house. I was doing the photocopies, and I remember I found these pieces of paper with his writings, with his elephant drawing, and actually the elephant has a sort of a significance in the sense of it being a very dignified animal. So it's sometimes a symbol of the samadhi that the elephant has this. That samadhi has this quality of being powerful and moving with great grace. If somebody who has samadhi moves like an elephant. Okay, so thank you very much. It's wonderful to do this study with you. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you very much for joining us in this study, and see you again next week.